On the morning of July 20th, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabreski of the 56th Fighter Group climbed into the cockpit of a Republic P-47D Thunderbolt at Boxted airfield in Essex and flew what would be the last combat mission of the most decorated American fighter career in the European theater of operations. He was 24 years old. He carried 28 confirmed aerial victories over Luftwaffe fighters. In 2 years of combat over France, Holland, Belgium, and Germany, no German pilot who had committed to an engagement against him had survived it. No German pilot had brought him down. What ended his war was not a Messerschmitt Bf 109. It was not a Focke-Wulf Fw 190. It was the ground. During a low-altitude strafing pass over a German airfield, his propeller struck the earth. The vibration ran through the airframe in a fraction of a second, a specific catastrophic pulse from the propeller shaft through the engine mounts and into the seat beneath him. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 seized. Gabreski belly-landed a Thunderbolt in a field in western Germany, climbed out of the cockpit, and ran. He was captured before he reached the tree line. He would spend the rest of the war at Stalag Luft I on the Baltic coast. The detail that matters is not his capture. It is what brought him to 50 feet above a German airfield with 8 guns firing and a propeller close enough to the earth to touch it. Because the same tactical geometry that had made him untouchable to every Luftwaffe pilot who had ever tried to engage him had placed him in the one physical relationship with the German defense system where his aircraft could reach the ground and the ground could reach back. This is the story of that geometry. It begins with the most formidable anti-aircraft organization ever assembled, built and refined over 3 years, specifically to destroy American aircraft at the altitudes the American bombing campaign required. And it ends with the discovery that the entire system had a zone it could not cover at the altitude its designers had never needed to consider, and with what it cost both sides when American fighter pilots found it. If you're finding this story compelling, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from today. By the spring of 1944, the German Flak arm was the largest anti-aircraft organization in history. It employed approximately 900,000 personnel, organized into Flak corps, divisions, and brigades layered across every significant industrial target in the Reich and the occupied territories. Its primary weapon was the 88mm gun, which had entered service as the Flak 18 in the early 1930s and been refined through the Flak 36 variant into an instrument of considerable sophistication. But by 1944, the gun itself was only the visible element of an integrated system. What the Germans had built around it combined radar acquisition, centralized fire control, and mathematically computed fuse settings calculated by specialized predictor units positioned at each battery. The gun was not pointed at an aircraft. It was pointed at a location in space calculated to intersect the aircraft's projected position in approximately 40 seconds. Against heavy bombers flying straight and level at 25,000 feet, this system was effective. It was effective because the bombers were required to fly straight and level. The Norden bomb sight, which justified the entire strategic bombing doctrine, needed stable flight, constant airspeed, and level altitude through the final minutes of the bomb run to compute an accurate release point. The Flak system below needed a target flying a predictable straight line through a fixed altitude for long enough to set a fuse and fire a pattern into the space the aircraft was calculated to occupy. These two requirements, the bombers and the Flaks, were identical. The American strategic bombing doctrine and the German air defense doctrine had been built for each other, and the men who suffered the intersection were the crews inside the bombers. The operational costs were visible in 8th Air Force loss records throughout the second half of 1943. On October 14th of that year, 291 B-17 Flying Fortresses launched from bases in England against the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt in central Germany. 60 did not return. Of the 229 that did, 17 were written off as damage beyond repair. Survivor debriefs that evening described the same environment from different aircraft positions. Walls of black smoke, the concussion of near misses without any visual warning, aircraft that simply were present and then were not. The losses over the target itself where the bomb run held the formation in the Flak's engagement zone for between 4 and 7 minutes, with a central fact of every account. What those debriefs reflected was not a problem unique to October 14th. It was the foundational problem of the air war over Germany. The engagement geometry the American bombing campaign required was the engagement geometry the German flak arm had been built to exploit, and by the autumn of 1943, the Germans had had 2.5 years to refine the exploitation. The answer to this problem did not come from altitude. It came from below. The Republic P-47D Thunderbolt that Francis Gabreski flew in the summer of 1944 was the largest and heaviest single-engine fighter aircraft in the American inventory. It was powered by the Pratt & Whitney R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder twin-row radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower at military power settings and 2,300 at war emergency. It weighed approximately 14,500 pounds at combat load. Its 8 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, for in each wing, fired at a combined rate of approximately 6,400 rounds per minute. At 30,000 feet, it could reach 428 miles per hour. At 50 feet, running flat out in level flight, it achieved approximately 350. None of these specifications explain why the P-47 was the aircraft for what was about to happen. The explanation was the R-2800 engine and what its construction permitted a pilot to survive. The R-2800 was air-cooled. Air-cooled radials could absorb ground fire damage that would kill a liquid-cooled engine in minutes. A single round through the coolant system of a Merlin or an Allison destroyed the aircraft. The coolant drained, the engine seized, and the pilot had minutes at most to find somewhere to land. The same round entering the cylinder block of an R-2800 might destroy 1 or 2 of the engine's 18 cylinders. The remaining 16 kept producing power. Pilots flying P-47s had returned from engagements with multiple cylinder heads shot away, oil lines severed, and turbo supercharger systems partially destroyed. The aircraft continued to function. Not perfectly, well enough. This mattered at 50 feet in ways it did not matter at 25,000. At altitude, a damaged engine meant altitude to trade for distance, time to assess, options. At 50 feet, a damaged engine was a different equation entirely. The R-2800's capacity to take punishment and keep a pilot flying was the reason the P-47 could go to 50 feet over a defended target, accept hits, and return to Boxted with the holes in its belly to prove it. The shift toward low-altitude attack did not begin with a formal directive from 8th Air Force Headquarters. It began with the operational reality of fuel and targets. Fighter groups completing their escort responsibilities over Germany had fuel remaining when the bombers separated and the escort was dismissed. Below them, visible from any altitude over western or central Germany on a clear day, was the German transportation network, a dense arterial system of railway track, locomotives, rolling stock, road convoys, marshalling yards, and canal barges that moved everything the German war economy required to function. A locomotive pulling coal from the Ruhr to a steel plant was not a dramatic military target. It was also the thing the German war economy could not run without. General William Kepner, commanding 8th Fighter Command from his headquarters in England, formalized what his pilots had already begun doing on their own initiative. Fighter groups, completing their primary escort responsibilities, would engage targets of opportunity at low altitude on the return leg. The authorization was deliberately broad, because what a returning flight found below it varied by mission, by weather, and by location, and the targeting decisions belonged to the pilot who could see the target. What the pilots found when they descended was the geometry. The 88mm Flak 36 that formed the backbone of German heavy anti-aircraft defense had been engineered for the engagement problem it faced in 1941 and 1942. Formations of medium and heavy bombers approaching at altitudes between 10,000 and 30,000 feet. The gun's elevation mechanism traversed from a fixed mechanical minimum below the horizontal plane to 85 degrees above it. Below that minimum, the barrel could not physically travel. The mechanical stop was not a design flaw. It was irrelevant to the targets the gun had been designed to engage. High-altitude bombers did not fly below it. At 50 feet altitude, a P-47 at close range was geometrically below that elevation limit. The required angle from the gun muzzle to the aircraft's flight path was not the few degrees of depression the Flak 36 could achieve. It was well beyond the barrel's mechanical range of travel. The crew of an 88mm battery, when a strafing aircraft was inbound, was in the position of men standing behind a weapon that could not be aimed at what was in front of them. German unit records from Flak positions in the Western Theater, examined after the war, reflect the practical response to this constraint. 88mm crews sheltered during low-level attacks. They were not standing at guns they could not point at the target. This is not a characterization of the Flak arms personnel as lacking in resolve. It is a description of the rational response to a mathematical constraint. A crew exposed at gun position during a strafing pass from a weapon that 88mm fire could not engage had placed itself in danger for no defensive gain. German Flak discipline was exact, and the documentation is clear. The primary weapon of the Reich air defense was operationally irrelevant against aircraft that had descended below its minimum engagement angle. The light Flak assigned to cover the lower altitude band had a different problem. The 20mm Flak 38, the standard light anti-aircraft weapon in German Flak order of battle by 1944, could be traversed through a full range of elevation and could be directed at targets below the horizontal plane. A crew at a 20mm position when a strafing aircraft was inbound had a weapon that could at least be physically pointed at the threat. The gun's cyclic rate was approximately 450 rounds per minute. What it could not reliably do was produce an accurate tracking solution against a target approaching at 350 miles per hour at 50 feet. The 20mm Flak 38 was a manually tracked weapon. The gunner followed the target through the weapon's sight, leading the aircraft by the angular distance required to put rounds into its path, rather than where it had been a fraction of a second before. Against a target at moderate speed at ranges of 1,000 meters or more, this was achievable with training. Against a P-47 at 50 feet, the tracking problem changed in kind at close range. The closure rate from 500 meters to the gun position at that speed was approximately 3 seconds. During those 3 seconds, the angular velocity of the approaching aircraft across the gunner's tracking arc was increasing continuously, most steeply in the final second before the aircraft was overhead. The lead angle required to put a burst into the aircraft's path, rather than its recent position, was not a fixed number to be applied. It was a changing number, increasing faster than the manual traverse mechanism of the weapon could follow as the closing distance fell below 200 meters. The evidence for what the tracking produced was recorded in the damage assessments on every returning P-47 at Boxted and the other 8 fighter command fighter bases. The pattern was consistent across months of records. Strikes in the lower surfaces of the rear fuselage and tail sections of the aircraft, behind the cockpit, behind the wing roots. Not in the nose or forward fuselage that would indicate the weapon had been leading the aircraft correctly. Behind, in the positions consistent with a gun firing at the aircraft's location approximately 1 to 2 seconds before the trigger was pressed. The 20mm crews were not failing to engage. They were engaging. Rounds were arriving in the aircraft. Some aircraft were being damaged significantly enough to require grounding. A few did not return to their bases. The light Flak was not absent from the equation. It was present in the equation in the specific way the geometry permitted. Fire that arrived behind the aircraft position during the approach, with occasional hits when the aircraft happened to fly into the trail of fire that the tracking had placed where the aircraft had been. During those same 2 to 3 seconds of the approach, the P-47's 8.50 caliber guns were firing approximately 300 rounds into the area of the target ahead of the aircraft's line. The gun crews who stayed at their light Flak positions during a strafing approach were absorbing a volume of fire that the approaching aircraft's own weapons were producing faster than any manual response could be organized. The practical result was the same as at the 88mm position. Effective covering of gun crews was a rational response, because the rounds that could have been fired in the seconds of the approach carried insufficient probability of hit to justify the exposure. The discovery being made in this way over German rail lines and airfields in the spring of 1944 was the same discovery that had been made by modified B-25 Mitchell crews over Japanese shipping in the Southwest Pacific. Neither group of pilots had read the other's reports. They had found the same result through the same mechanism: descent to the altitude where the defense's primary weapons could not track, where the engagement geometry of the defense had been built for ceased to apply. The difference was the environment at 50 feet. And the environment at 50 feet was not empty. Power lines crossed Germany in a network that did not appear on every available chart. Trees at field margins and along road embankments were the precise height to intersect a low-level flight path without warning. Chimneys attached to buildings that were not the target rose to altitudes that required a correction during the approach. Debris from the aircraft's own strafing rounds rose from the target at angles that intersected the flight path of the aircraft on its way across. And there was the ground itself, which at 50 feet of altitude left no margin for a control input that was a degree too large, a mechanical distraction during the approach, or a small correction that at 350 miles per hour had no time to be recovered. This was the other side of the geometry that defeated German tracking. The altitude that removed the aircraft from the 88 mm engagement arc and from the 20 mm tracking capability was also the altitude at which the physical environment at 50 feet became a hazard of a different kind. Not a hazard that the German defense was producing. A hazard that the geometry of the approach itself produced, and that a propeller tip at the bottom of the aircraft's rotation was exactly the right dimension to encounter. If this story is landing with you, take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep producing work like this. Colonel Hubert Zemke commanded the 56th Fighter Group at Boxted through the critical months of 1944. He was 40 years old, a precise and demanding officer who had built the group into the highest-scoring fighter unit in the European theater and who had understood, before most of his contemporaries, that a fighter group capable of killing German aircraft in the air was also a fighter group capable of destroying German war material on ground. The two roles were not in competition. They were complements, and the summer of 1944 was when the complementary nature of the high-altitude and low-altitude mission became operationally visible. The German response to the low-level strafing campaign was prompt and in important respects rational and in fundamental respects insufficient. The Flak units protecting the rail lines most frequently attacked received augmented light weapons through the spring. Flak cars carrying the Focke-Wulf 38, the quadruple 20mm anti-aircraft mount that could produce a combined rate of fire approaching 2,000 rounds per minute, were added to train consists on the primary target corridors. Anti-aircraft positions along key rail segments were reinforced. Aircraft at forward Luftwaffe airfields were dispersed from centralized parking aprons to individual hardened revetments and camouflage dispersal points at field perimeters, reducing the efficiency of any single strafing pass across a packed parking area. Each of these responses addressed the surface symptoms of the problem without reaching the underlying geometry. The Focke-Wulf 38 on a Flak car was still a manually tracked weapon. More barrels producing more rounds per minute did not solve the angular velocity problem that made tracking at close range and high closure speeds unreliable. More rounds fired with insufficient tracking accuracy were more rounds arriving behind the aircraft rather than into it. The mounting of the weapon on rolling stock and the presence of the trained crew at their stations during an attack produced the same probability of hit calculations that the single 20mm positions had been producing. Low, concentrated in the tail sections of the departing aircraft, insufficient to prevent the attack from achieving its effect. The dispersal of aircraft at German airfields introduced a different operational problem than it solved. An aircraft in a dispersed revetment required individual attack passes to service, rather than a formation sweep across a crowded parking apron. This meant that the strafing aircraft needed to make multiple passes to achieve the same number of individual kills it had previously accomplished in fewer. Multiple passes through a now-alerted defense were more costly than the first pass, because the gun crews that had taken cover during the first approach had time to return to their weapons before the aircraft circled for a second or third. The dispersal protected German aircraft from the most efficient form of the attack, which was the first-pass sweep, at the cost of requiring the attacking pilot to absorb an increasing volume of fire on subsequent passes in exchange for each additional target engaged. This was the operational environment in which Gabreski flew through June and into July of 1944. He was due to rotate home. His tour was complete. The decision to fly one final armed reconnaissance mission on the morning of July 20th was his own. What happened on the last strafing pass of that mission is in the historical record in the outline he provided in later accounts. He was lower than intended during the final pass, and his propeller contacted the ground. The engine seized, and the aircraft could not continue flight. He put it down in the nearest available field and climbed out. The German flak arm had not shot him down. His own aircraft's propeller had reached the altitude the tactic required him to maintain. Part 2 continues from here. The summer and autumn of 1944, when the low-level campaign reached its full operational effect on the German transportation network, when Flak division commanders in the Western Theater were writing assessments to their superiors that described the problem with more precision than the available solutions could address, and when the United States Strategic Bombing Survey, examining German records after the war ended, put numbers to what the geometry had produced and what it had cost. The summer of 1944 was when the logic of the low-level campaign became visible not in individual after-action reports, but in the operational picture across the entire Western Front. The discovery that American fighter pilots had made in the spring, the discovery that the German flak arm's primary weapons had a geometric floor below which they could not engage, had been absorbed into the doctrine of two separate air commands, and was now being applied at scale that the German military's own records would later measure in tons of coal, miles of usable rail, and days of movement lost. Major General Elwood Quesada commanded 9 Tactical Air Command, the fighter-bomber organization assigned to support Allied ground forces in France. He was 40 years old in the summer of 1944, an officer who had spent years before the war studying the integration of aircraft with ground operations in ways that the pre-war Army Air Corps had not officially sanctioned. Quesada was not interested in the high-altitude strategic bombing mission. He was interested in what a P-47 carrying 500-pound bombs and rockets could do to a German armored column moving on a French road toward a beachhead. And in the summer of 1944, he had the aircraft, the authority, and a German army that had to move at daylight to find out. The answer he found was documented on the German side with a specificity that amounts to testimony. A column of German vehicles on a French road, encountered by 9 TC fighter bombers at low altitude, was not attacked once. It was attacked continuously because the aircraft could reposition and return while the vehicles remained committed to the road surface. The first pass typically destroyed the lead and trailing elements of the column, using rocket fire or 500-pound bombs, immobilizing the entire formation between burning vehicles that could not be moved past. Subsequent passes worked down the stationary column with .50 caliber guns. The men in the vehicles had two choices: remain with the vehicles and absorb the fire, or abandon the vehicles and disperse into the surrounding terrain on foot. Both choices ended the column's military function. The vehicles were either destroyed or abandoned, and an armored force without its vehicles is not an armored force. German unit after-action reports from Normandy in June and July of 1944 are consistent enough in their description of this experience to read as a single document written by different hands. Movement during daylight hours was described as operationally impossible when Allied air was active over the operational area. Fuel convoys that attempted road movement in daylight were destroyed routinely enough that the planning assumption shifted. Fuel would move at night, and only at night, and the amount that could be moved at night constrained what could be done during the day. The Panzerlehr Division, one of the most capable armored formations in the German order of battle, documented in its reports for the weeks after D-Day a pattern of attrition that its commanding officer, General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, later described in post-war accounts as unlike anything the division had experienced on the Eastern Front. Not because the losses in absolute terms were greater than those absorbed in Russia, but because the losses on the roads in Normandy came from an angle and altitude where the organic anti-aircraft weapons of the formation could not engage the attacker effectively. The organic anti-aircraft weapons of a German panzer division in 1944 were primarily towed 20mm guns and self-propelled quadruple 20mm mounts on half-tracks. They were effective weapons against aircraft attacking at moderate altitudes and moderate speeds. Against P-47s and P-51s coming in at 50 feet at 350 miles per hour, they presented the same tracking problem the railway Flak car guns presented, the same problem the fixed flak positions at German airfields presented. The angular velocity of the attacking aircraft as it closed to effective range exceeded what manually controlled guns could follow without a targeting solution that was already obsolete by the time the trigger was pressed. The flak arm itself was arriving at the same conclusion through its own channels. Assessments written by Flak division commanders in France and in the Western Reich during the summer of 1944 described the low-level attack problem in the language of a command that has examined its weapons against a specific threat and found its weapons unsuitable. The heavy flak, the 88mm and larger guns, could not be employed against aircraft at the altitudes the fighter bombers were using during the attack phase. The light flak could be and was employed, but its effectiveness against fast low-altitude attackers was documented as significantly degraded compared to its effectiveness against aircraft at medium altitudes and reduced speed. The assessments requested additional weapons, specifically radar-directed light flak that could reduce the dependence on manual tracking, and more of it dispersed along the most frequently attacked routes. Neither was available in quantity sufficient to change the operational picture. The radar-directed light flak systems that could have addressed the tracking problem existed in German inventory, but they were concentrated in the defense of fixed high-value targets, not distributed along hundreds of miles of rail lines and road corridors. And the problem of distributing weapons capable of engaging fast low-level attackers along a front that stretched across France and into Western Germany was not solvable with the production resources available to the German flak arm in the summer of 1944. The Falaise pocket in August of that year was the most concentrated demonstration of what the low-level campaign had achieved. The German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, attempting to withdraw from encirclement by Allied ground forces closing from north and south, were caught in open terrain during daylight with Allied air power active overhead. The records of the engagement from both sides document the same afternoon. Roads blocked with burning vehicles, columns that had stopped and could not resume movement, men on foot because the vehicles were gone. The number of German armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned in the Falaise pocket by ground action and by air attack combined represents one of the largest single losses of German armor material in the Western European campaign. The proportion attributable to air attack, specifically to the low-level fighter-bomber sweeps that caught the withdrawal in daylight, was documented by Allied and German sources both. The German army that came out of Falaise was not the German army that had entered Normandy 6 weeks before. It had crossed the Seine on foot in large numbers, having left its vehicles on French roads under circumstances that the low-level attack had produced. The training, the organization, and the experience remained. The material was on the roads. In Germany itself, through the autumn and early winter of 1944, the effect on the transportation network that 8th Fighter Command had been systematically attacking since the previous spring was accumulating in the records of the Reichsbahn and in the production statistics of industries dependent on it. Coal shipments from the Ruhr to German steel-producing centers declined sharply as both the rail infrastructure and the locomotive fleet were degraded below the threshold required for normal operational scheduling. Steel deliveries to armament factories fell in proportion. The German armaments production that Albert Speer had built to its 1944 peak was discovering that the weapons could be manufactured faster than the transportation system could move the raw materials to make them. Speer himself, interrogated by Allied intelligence officers after the German surrender, identified the transportation campaign as the single most damaging aspect of the Allied air offensive against the German war economy. Not the strategic bombing of oil refineries, which had its own severe effect. Not the direct attacks on armament plants, which the dispersion and underground construction programs had partly mitigated. The destruction of the transportation network's capacity to move material from where it was produced to where it was needed, across the range of altitudes and attack profiles that the Allied air forces had employed, but most critically at the low levels where the German flak arm's primary weapons could not engage, was the element spear identified as the one the German war economy could not absorb. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, the systematic post-war assessment of the air war's economic effects conducted by a team of American analysts with access to German records and direct interviews with German officials, reached similar conclusions. The transportation campaign had produced dislocation in the German production system that was not visible in the production figures for individual categories of weapons, but was visible in the overall capacity of the German economy to sustain production and distribute output. The rail network that had moved German industrial output efficiently in 1942 and 1943 was, by the winter of 1944-45, operating at a fraction of that capacity. The low-level attack campaign was a significant contributor to that reduction, because it had operated continuously against a target system that the German flak defenses built for high-altitude engagement could not protect. The cost of producing this result was written in the records of every P-47 group that had flown the low-level missions. Aircraft were lost to ground fire. Some were brought down by the light flak that fired into the departing aircraft's flight path with enough regularity that some percentage of the rounds found their target. Some were lost to the airfield defenses that, while unable to track the approaching aircraft accurately, could produce enough volume of fire across the departure angle that individual aircraft were hit severely enough to lose the engine or the pilot before they could clear the threat area. The damage records from the 8 Fighter Command Maintenance Units at Boxted and the other English fighter bases showed P-47s returning with strikes that the R-2800 engine had absorbed and continued through, and they showed the gaps in the records where aircraft had not returned and the morning mission listings had their names struck off. Some were lost to the environment at 50 feet. Power lines and balloon cables across approach paths. Trees at field margins that rose into the flight path without the warning that altitude would have provided. Debris from the aircraft's own weapons. The fragments of a locomotive boiler struck by .50 caliber fire rising at the aircraft behind it as it cleared the target at 50 feet with no altitude to trade for clearance. In several documented cases, the cause of loss was recorded as unknown because the aircraft had simply not returned and no surviving pilot had been close enough to observe the final moments. And some were lost, as Gabreski was lost, not to German weapons and not to wire or tree, but to the ground itself, to the same 50 feet that defeated the German tracking systems touching the propeller arc of the aircraft that held to it. The 56th Fighter Group continued at Boxted after Gabreski's capture. Colonel Zemke continued to command it until October of 1944, when his own aircraft, a P-51 Mustang he had transitioned to when the group converted from Thunderbolts, went out of control in a severe weather system over Germany. Zemke bailed out and was captured. The group that continued under subsequent commanders flew the same missions against the same categories of targets at the same altitudes. What changed was the names in the cockpits and the names in the briefing rooms. Gabreski was at Stalag Luft I Neerbarth on the Baltic coast from July of 1944 until May of 1945, when Soviet ground forces reaching the camp prompted the Germans to abandon it and the American prisoners to take it over until air transport could arrange evacuation. He was 25 years old when he walked out. He returned to the Air Force. He flew in Korea beginning in 1950, where he flew the North American F-86 Sabre against MiG-15 fighters flown by Soviet, Chinese, and North Korean pilots. He added 6.5 confirmed aerial victories in Korea. He became one of a very small number of American pilots who achieved ace status in 2 separate wars. He retired from the Air Force as a colonel and lived to the age of 82. He never discussed in detail, in the accounts available in the historical record, what the summer of 1944 at 50 feet had required of the men who flew it. What is in the record is what he did, which was fly 66 missions before the propeller touched the ground and return to flight operations after the war was over. The German Flak arm that had been the most effective anti-aircraft force in history, that had shot down more American aircraft over Germany than the entire Luftwaffe fighter force, had no record of shooting down Francis Gabreski. The system built specifically to destroy American aircraft at altitude, designed and refined over 3 years to exploit the engagement geometry the American strategic bombing doctrine required, had been unable to solve the problem of 8 P-47 at 50 feet flying at 350 miles per hour. The guns that could reach that altitude could not be aimed at it. The guns that could be aimed at it could not track it with the speed and precision the engagement geometry required. The wall of steel the German Flak arm had constructed over the industrial heart of the Reich was real, and it was lethal, and it killed thousands of American airmen between 1942 and 1945. Against the aircraft that came in below it, below the minimum elevation arc of the 88mm guns that had defined the air defense of Germany, at the speeds that exceeded the manual tracking capability of the 20mm systems designed to cover the lower altitude band. It had no answer. The problem had been examined. The solutions available had been applied. The geometry had not changed. What this cost Germany is in the transportation records and the production figures and the post-war testimony of the men who had managed the German war economy and watched it come apart in the final year of the war. What it cost the men who flew the missions is in the squadron rosters and the maintenance logs and the morning briefing sheets with names struck through. Both numbers belong to the same story. There is no version of the low-level campaign that produces only disrupted German rail schedules. There is no version of the geometry that freed the attacking aircraft from the Flak's primary weapons without placing it at the altitude where the propeller could reach the ground. The tactic that the German Flak arm could not answer required the men who flew it to hold 50 feet above the earth at 350 miles per hour with 8 guns firing, which is its own category of demand. Unrelated to the category of demand the 88mm gun had placed on the cruise at 25,000 feet and related only to itself. The men who flew these missions are in the historical record and in what the historical record does not contain. Francis Gabreski is in the record because he survived Stalag Luft I and flew again and lived to old age and was willing afterward to say what he had done. The others are in the records of the missions they flew, the targets they hit, the aircraft they returned in with the damage patterns that confirmed the tracking problem in the light of the maintenance bay. The aircraft they flew, the Republic P-47D Thunderbolt with its air-cooled engine and its 8 guns and its capacity to bring a pilot home from things that would have ended a liquid-cooled fighter, is in museums now. The guns point forward because that was the configuration. That was always the configuration. Against the most sophisticated anti-aircraft system ever assembled, specifically designed and refined over 3 years to destroy American aircraft at the altitudes American doctrine required. It turned out that the answer was to come in below the floor of the system's engagement arc and fly at the speed where the guns that remained available to the defense could not complete a tracking solution before the aircraft had passed through the zone and the pilot was already looking for a place to go. Around and try again. The German Flak commanders who wrote their assessments up the chain of command through the summer and autumn of 1944 were writing about a problem they had identified accurately and could not solve with the weapons at hand. The assessment that the low-level fast attack profile was the hardest to defend against, harder than the torpedo bomber, harder than the dive bomber, harder than the medium-altitude level bomber that the entire system had been built to stop, was an accurate assessment. It was also an assessment that arrived too late to produce a solution before the war ended. That is where the story of the geometry ends. Not with a single engagement and not with a single pilot, but with an assessment written by the men who had tried to stop it and could not, and with the country they were defending reduced to the winter of 1944 to 45 at a fraction of its industrial capacity. Because the transportation network that had moved its coal and steel and weapons from one part of the Reich to another had been attacked continuously, for months, at an altitude where the guns built to defend it could. Not point. Thank you for watching. For more stories like this one, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.